At 20 years old, Clara Wren stood at the edge of everything she had ever known, holding a rope lead in one hand and 4 crumpled dollars in the other. It was her uncle, Silas Pruitt, who cast her out, claiming her late father's farm was drowning in debts only a stranger's signature could settle, and that there was no place at the table for a niece who could not pay her way. All she had left in the world was that handful of dollars, a tin trunk of her mother's things, and the dog pressed warm against her leg, a red-coated hound named Copper who would not leave her side. With nowhere else to turn, she spent 2 of those dollars on a courthouse auction listing nobody else wanted, an abandoned, condemned cooperage at the edge of town, sealed shut for 6 years. Folks called it foolish. They did not know that beneath its rotted floor lay a secret that would not only save her, but set right a wrong that had been quietly strangling their whole town for a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Wren and her faithful dog, Copper. If this story of quiet courage and an unlikely inheritance moves you, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and stay with us until the very end. Clara Wren had been raised to believe that worth was not something a person was handed, but something a person built, plank by plank, the way her father built everything else. Thomas Wren had been the blacksmith of Ashford Hollow, a modest river town tucked into the Missouri hill country, where the Ozark ridges softened into farmland, and where the year, in the autumn of 1886, was beginning to turn cold and gold at the edges. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a trusted one, the kind whose word was worth more than any banknote, and Clara had grown up in the ring of his hammer and the smell of coal smoke, learning early that a life could be shaped the same way iron was, with patience, with heat, and with the willingness to be struck and reshaped without breaking. Her mother had died when Clara was only 7, of a fever that swept through the hollow one wet spring, and so it had been Thomas who raised her alone, teaching her not only how to read a ledger and mend a harness, but how to look a hard year in the eye without flinching. It was Thomas who brought Copper home too, when Clara was 12. The dog had been the runt of a litter born to a farmer 3 miles upriver, red-brown and long-legged and utterly unwanted, the kind of pup folks said wouldn't survive the winter. Thomas had seen something in the way the small dog refused to lie down and be forgotten, the way he kept dragging himself back to the feed trough, even after the bigger pups shoved him aside, and he had carried the pup home in his coat and set him in Clara's lap without a word. Some things, he told her, aren't worth much to anybody until somebody decides to see them different. Clara did not know, then, that her father was not only speaking of the dog. She only knew that from that night on, Copper slept curled against her feet, and grew, over the years, into a broad-chested hound, with a nose that seemed to know the world by scent before her eyes ever caught up to it. Clara remembered, too, the particular quiet of the forge on winter evenings, when the last customer had gone, and her father let the fire burn low, and how he would sometimes talk to her not as a child, but as a partner in some unspoken understanding, telling her that a blacksmith who cheated a farmer on the weight of a plowshare might get away with it once, or twice, but that the debt of dishonesty always came due eventually, in ways a man rarely got to choose. She had not understood, at 10 or 12, why he spoke so often of debts and honesty in the same breath, only that it seemed important to him that she remember it, the way some fathers made their daughters memorize scripture, or a family Bible's births and deaths. Copper, by then already grown from a runt into a broad, watchful hound, would lie across her feet during these talks, as though he too were listening, and Clara would sometimes catch her father watching the two of them together, with an expression she could not name until much later, when she understood it simply as a man storing up comfort against a future he suspected might not be kind to either of them. Ashford Hollow was, in those years, a town built on cooperation in more than name. Its farmers shared a grain mill on the river bend, a covered bridge that 4 families had raised together after a flood, and a cooperage, a barrel-making shop, run by an old craftsman named Josiah Tuck, who had for 30 years bent white oak staves into the barrels that carried the Hollow's flour, cider, and salted pork to market in the county seat. Thomas Wren and Josiah Tuck had been friends since boyhood, two men who believed that a town's strength was only as strong as the honesty running underneath it, and Clara had grown up doing small errands for old Tuck, fetching water for his steam kettle, sweeping curls of oak shavings from his floor, learning without knowing it the particular language of coopering, how a stave was chosen, how a hoop was driven, how a barrel, built right, could hold pressure for 100 years, without a single drop escaping. It was Josiah Tuck, in fact, who had first warned Thomas, quietly, that something was wrong in Ashford Hollow. The town's land agent and sole banker, a smooth, unhurried man named Elias Corbin, had been buying up mortgages on struggling farms for years, always with a sympathetic smile, and always, somehow, on terms that grew crueler the moment a farmer fell behind. Tuck had noticed, in his ledgers, that the cooperative mill's grain weights never quite matched what farmers swore they'd delivered, and that Corbin's own warehouse always seemed to grow fuller than arithmetic allowed. He had begun keeping his own careful records, in the private, meticulous hand of a man who trusted numbers more than he trusted talk, tucking pages away where prying eyes would not find them. Then, in the spring before Clara turned 16, Josiah Tuck had died of a sudden fever of his own, and within a year, his cooperage, deprived of buyers, its trade quietly steered elsewhere by men loyal to Corbin, was boarded up and forgotten, its secrets, if it had any, sealed inside with the dust. Clara had grieved Tuck the way one grieves a second father, and had watched, without fully understanding it, as her own father grew quieter in the years after, more careful about what he said and to whom, more insistent that Clara learned to keep her own counsel and her own accounts. "A person who owns nothing," he told her once, mending a wagon wheel by lamplight, "is still rich, if she owns her own good name. Guard it closer than any coin." Clara had taken the words to heart, without knowing how soon she would need them, and had grown, in the shadow of her father's forge, and old Tuck's cooperage, into a young woman, who was unafraid of hard work, unashamed of a patched dress, and entirely devoted to the loyal red hound, who had never once, in 8 years, let her walk anywhere alone. The fall, when it came the way frost comes to a field that has looked strong all season, quietly, at night, and total by morning. Thomas Wren was thrown from a spooked cart horse on a rain-slick road in the autumn of Clara's 20th year, and though he lingered 3 days, the injury to his skull would not let him wake fully again, and Ashford Hollow buried its blacksmith on a gray Thursday, with more mourners than the little church could hold. Clara stood at the grave with copper pressed to her skirts, and for the first time in her life she understood that grief was not only sorrow, but also a door swinging open onto an unknown room, one she would now have to walk through alone. It was her uncle, Silas Pruitt, who walked through that door first. Silas was Thomas's half-brother, a man who had spent most of his life in the county seat, trading in land and livestock, and who arrived at the farm within a week of the funeral, with a folder of papers and a manner so smooth, it took Clara 3 visits to notice how carefully he avoided her eyes. He explained, patiently, as though she were a child, that Thomas had taken loans against the farm 2 winters past. Loans, he said, arranged through the good offices of Elias Corbin's bank, and that with the debts called due, the property would have to be sold to settle them. He was terribly sorry, he said. He would, of course, see to it that she was not left destitute. He would allow her 2 weeks to gather her things before new owners took possession. Clara asked to see her father's own ledgers, the private books he had kept in his desk drawer, the ones that would show whether such loans were real or invented. She found the drawer forced open, and the ledgers gone, and when she asked Silas about it, he only spread his hands and said that grief made a person forgetful of where they'd put things. She asked the bank for copies of the loan papers, and was told, by a clerk who would not meet her gaze, that record-keeping in a small-town bank was sometimes imperfect, and that Mr. Corbin himself was traveling and could not be consulted for several weeks. She asked her father's neighbors, one by one, whether they had ever heard Thomas Wren speak of debt, and every one of them said the same thing, that Thomas Wren was the last man in the county who would have mortgaged his daughter's future, and that something about the whole business smelled wrong, though none of them could say exactly what. But suspicion does not pay a debt, and within 2 weeks, Clara Wren found herself standing in the yard she had been born in, watching strangers carry her father's tools into a wagon that was no longer hers to load. Silas Pruitt gave her $4 for the road, he called it, as though he were doing her a kindness, and Clara took the money because pride would not feed a dog, and walked away from the only home she had ever known with a tin trunk, a rope lead, and Copper pacing tight, worried circles around her ankles the whole way down the lane, as if the animal understood, even before she did, that the ground beneath them both had shifted for good. She spent that first night in the loft of the Ashford Hollow feed store, which the proprietor, a widow named Ruth Calloway who had loved Thomas Wren's honesty if not his misfortune, allowed her to use out of pity and old friendship. It was Ruth who mentioned, almost as an aside, that the county courthouse was auctioning off a handful of abandoned properties the following morning, to clear back taxes, among them the old tuck Cooperage, which nobody in 6 years had wanted to touch. "Cursed, some folks call it," Ruth said, shaking her head, "on account of poor Josiah dying so sudden, and the place just sitting there, rotting ever since. But it's cheap, if cheap is what a body needs." Clara, lying awake with Copper's head heavy on her knee, thought of Josiah Tuck's kind, careful hands, and of her father's warning about guarding one's good name, and something in her, not quite hope, but its stubborn cousin, decided that a roof, even a condemned one, was better than none at all. The auction was a small, dispiriting affair held on the courthouse steps in a thin cold rain, attended mostly by men looking to strip abandoned buildings for lumber and hardware. When the auctioneer called the tuck Cooperage, there was a long uninterested silence, broken only by one half-hearted bid of $1 from a scrap dealer who wanted the roof tin. Clara, standing at the back with Copper leaning against her leg, heard herself say, $2, before she had entirely decided to say anything at all, and the auctioneer, eager to be rid of the property and move along in the rain, brought his gavel down before the scrap dealer could think better of his silence. Silas Pruitt, who happened to be present on other courthouse business, laughed outright when he heard, loud enough for half the steps to hear, that his niece had spent her last coins on a haunted, condemned barrel shop nobody else would touch. Clara did not answer him. She only signed the paper the clerk pushed toward her, took the rusted key that came with it, and walked, with her dog and her trunk, toward the one piece of ground in Ashford Hollow that now, however strangely, belonged to her. The Cooperage stood at the edge of town nearest the river, a long low timber building with a steep roof gone soft and green with moss, its windows boarded, its door swollen shut with 6 winters of damp. Clara had to put her shoulder to it twice before the hinges gave with a groan that startled a pair of barn swallows from the eaves, and when she finally stepped inside, she was met with the smell she remembered from childhood errands: oak, and cold ash, and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of cider that had once been stored there. Dust hung thick in the shafts of gray light, coming through gaps in the boarded windows, and half-finished barrels stood in rows like patient old men waiting for a task that would never come, their hoops rusted, their staves furred with mold. Copper, who had trotted in ahead of her the moment the door opened, did not behave like a dog exploring new territory. He went straight and low across the floor, nose down, tail stiff and quivering, to a corner near the cold brick forge where the steaming pit had once stood, and there he began to scratch at the packed dirt floor with a single-minded urgency Clara had never seen in him before, whining low in his throat, circling, scratching again. "Copper, leave it," she said at first, tired and cold, and in no mood for a dog's foolishness, but he would not leave it, and something in the pitch of his whine, Not fear, not pain, but a kind of insistent, pleading excitement, made her come closer and kneel down beside him in the dust. It was there, in the dim light of her first hour as a property owner, that Clara Wren noticed what 6 years of neglect had hidden from every scrap dealer and curious neighbor who might have peered through a crack in the boards. A floor plank, whiter and newer grained than the others around the old steaming pit, its edges worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been lifted and set back many times by careful hands. For 3 days, Clara did not have the tools or the courage to pry up the plank Copper had found, occupied instead with more urgent matters: patching the roof against the coming rain with tin scavenged from a collapsed shed nearby, sweeping 6 years of dust from a single corner she could sleep in, and stretching her last coins on cornmeal and a bit of salt pork for herself and her dog. She told herself the loose plank was nothing, only warped wood, and that a woman with no money and no prospects had no business chasing a dog's fancies. But Copper would not let the matter rest. Every evening, once the day's work was done, he would return to that corner near the old forge, sniff at the plank's edges, and lie down across it with a proprietary air, as though guarding something he alone understood the value of. And on the 4th night, Clara finally took up the iron bar she'd found among Tuck's old tools, and knelt down to see what her dog had been so certain of all along. The plank came up with a groan of old nails, and beneath it, Clara found not dirt, as she'd expected, but a shallow wooden box, its lid sealed with pitch, the way Tuck used to seal the seams of his finest barrels, buried in a recess lined with flat river stones to keep out damp. Her hands shook as she worked the lid free. Copper pressed so close against her side she could feel his heart beating fast against her arm, and inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept the years mostly at bay, she found a thick ledger book in a hand she recognized at once from a dozen childhood afternoons spent sweeping his shavings. Josiah Tuck's own careful, patient script, along with a smaller bundle of folded papers, bearing wax seals she did not yet understand, and a single brass key far older and heavier than the one that had opened the Cooperage door. Copper would not leave the box once it was open, circling it twice, sniffing each corner of the oiled cloth, as though satisfying himself that the thing he had scented through the floorboards for 4 nights running had at last been properly acknowledged, and then settling, with a long contented sigh, into the exact spot where the plank had been, as though standing guard over ground he had already done the hard work of claiming. Clara found herself laughing softly despite the late hour and the strange gravity of what lay in her lap, scratching behind his ears and murmuring that he had known all along, hadn't he? Known long before she had the sense or the courage to look, and the dog thumped his tail twice against the swept dirt floor as if in agreement, then returned to his solemn watching, nose lifted now and then toward the door, as if some part of him understood that what they had found was not yet safe, and would not be safe, until she had done something with it. She did not sleep that night. By the light of a tallow candle, with Copper's head resting heavy across her knee as though he too were listening, Clara opened the ledger and began, page by page, to understand why Josiah Tuck had died with his Cooperage's future already quietly poisoned, and why the townsfolk had been made, gently and gradually, to forget he had ever kept books at all. The entries began ordinarily enough, dates and deliveries and the price of white oak staves, but threaded through them, in a second column Tuck had kept in smaller, more careful letters, was a record of something else entirely: the true weights of grain the cooperative farmers delivered to the mill, set beside the weights Elias Corbin's warehouse had officially recorded, the two numbers diverging, year over year, by amounts too consistent to be accident. Tuck had not only noticed Corbin skimming grain from every farmer's harvest, he had documented it, quietly, for nearly 6 years, alongside notes on loans made to struggling families, at terms that changed, without their knowledge, the moment they were too far behind to object. The folded papers beneath the ledger were harder still to make sense of at first, until Clara recognized, among the formal language and old wax seals, the original charter of the Ashford Hollow Farmers Cooperative, the document, drawn up a generation earlier, that had established the shared mill and shared bridge as common property of every founding family, including the Wrens, rather than as the private holdings Elias Corbin's bank now claimed to control. Tucked within that same bundle, folded so small it had nearly slipped free, was a torn scrap in her own father's hand, dated only months before his death, that read simply, "JT, if anything should happen to either of us, the truth is where the barrels are made, guard it. TW." Clara sat with that scrap of paper a long while, copper's warm weight anchoring her to the cold floor, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night, that her father had known about Corbin's fraud, that Josiah Tuck had hidden the proof in the one place no one thought to look, and that her uncle Silas Pruitt's sudden, convenient debt papers were very likely no debt at all, but a lie built to seize a farm whose owner had grown dangerous to Elias Corbin's schemes. The brass key, she would discover only days later, opened nothing in the cooperage itself, but matched a strongbox kept, of all places, in the vault of Corbin's own bank, a detail noted in Tuck's ledger as insurance, a place where a second copy of certain documents had been lodged under an assumed name, safe from anyone who thought to search the cooperage alone. It was, Clara realized with a slow, frightened wonder, an inheritance far heavier than $4 and a condemned building. It was proof, if she was brave enough and clever enough to use it, that could unmake the very man who had helped unmake her. She did not act rashly. Clara Wren had learned patience at her father's forge, and caution at Josiah Tuck's coopering bench, and she understood, turning the ledger's pages by candlelight, with Copper's steady breathing beside her, that a single woman, with no money, and a dog for a witness, could not simply march into Elias Corbin's bank, waving old papers, and expect justice to follow. She spent the better part of 2 weeks doing quiet, careful work instead, repairing the cooperage roof well enough to keep the ledger dry, copying key pages of Tuck's records in her own hand, in case the originals were ever seized or destroyed, and, carefully, one conversation at a time, speaking with the farmers whose names appeared in Tuck's second column, women and men who had spent years believing their own memories of harvest weights must simply be mistaken. It was Ruth Calloway, the feed store widow, who first believed her without hesitation, remembering aloud how her own husband, before he died, used to grumble that the mill's scales never seemed to favor a farmer twice in a row. Others were harder to convince, wary of accusing the town's only banker of anything, afraid of what it might cost them if Clara's proof turned out to be nothing more than an old man's grudge. Word travels quickly in a small hollow though, and it was not long before Elias Corbin himself learned that the Wren girl was asking careful questions about grain weights and old loans, and that she had been seen, more than once, deep in conversation with a red hound at her heel, and a ledger book tucked under her arm. In those same uneasy days, Clara noticed that Copper's habits had changed in small but unmistakable ways, as though the dog understood, better than she sometimes did herself, that danger had followed the truth home. He no longer settled easily in the evenings, choosing instead to lie across the cooperage doorway, rather than at her feet by the fire, ears lifting at every footstep on the road, and twice in 1 week, he woke her before dawn, with low, urgent barking at nothing she could see, only to have her discover, come morning, boot prints in the mud near the window that did not belong to Ruth Calloway or any friendly visitor. She took to sleeping with the ledger and its copied pages hidden beneath a loose hearthstone rather than in the open trunk, and took comfort, on the coldest and most uncertain nights, in the simple fact that no one, however bold, seemed willing to test the temper of a hound who had already proven he would put himself between his mistress and any man who meant her harm. Corbin came to the cooperage himself on a cold, bright afternoon, smiling the same smooth smile Clara remembered from her father's funeral, and offered, with great show of neighborly concern, to buy the condemned building back from her for $20. A fortune, he pointed out gently, to a young woman with nothing else in the world. Clara understood, standing in her own doorway with Copper's hackles slowly rising at her side, that the offer was not generosity, but fear dressed in a banker's Sunday coat, and she declined as politely as she could manage, saying only that she had grown rather fond of the old place. Corbin's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and still, and he told her, in the same pleasant voice, that condemned buildings had a habit of being condemned further, and that a young woman alone would do well to remember how quickly a town's sympathy could turn if she made herself a nuisance to the people who kept its accounts. The threat, veiled as it was, proved to be the mistake that undid him. Within days, the very families Corbin had hoped to keep silent began comparing notes openly at the mill, and after Sunday services, each recalling some year when their harvest had felt lighter in the wagon than it should have, and each remembering, now that Clara had given them permission to say it aloud, some small unfairness in a loan's terms that had never quite made sense. Silas Pruitt, hearing that his niece had somehow come into possession of records concerning the bank, arrived at the Cooperage in a fury one evening, demanding she hand over whatever nonsense she was spreading, and it was Copper, placid, patient Copper, who had never so much as growled at a stranger in his life, who placed himself squarely between Clara and her uncle, teeth bared, low and steady, until Silas backed toward his horse, muttering that she would regret her stubbornness. Clara did not doubt, watching him ride away, that her uncle and Elias Corbin had been partners in the scheme from the very beginning, her father's farm merely the most convenient prize to seize once he grew too watchful to control. Clara took her copied pages and the original charter to the one man in the county both sides trusted to be fair, Judge Amos Hartley, who rode a circuit through 3 counties and happened to be due in Ashford Hollow within the week to hear routine business. She did not go to him alone. Half the cooperative's founding families walked with her to the little courthouse, Ruth Calloway at the front, and Copper trotting proud and alert at Clara's side, as though he understood, finally, the shape of the thing he had dug out of the dirt. Judge Hartley read Tuck's meticulous ledger, with the slow, careful attention of a man who had seen a great many liars in his years on the bench, and had learned to recognize the particular texture of the truth, and when he set the papers down, he asked only one question of the gathered farmers, whether any among them could swear that Josiah Tuck had ever, in 30 years, been known to falsify a number. Not one of them could recall a single instance, and several recalled, instead, small kindnesses, a barrel mended for free, a debt quietly forgiven, that painted the old Cooper as a man almost incapable of the fraud he stood accused of concealing. Against that testimony, Elias Corbin's protests that the ledger was forged, or stolen, or the ravings of a bitter old man, rang thin and false even to those in the room who had liked him. The brass key, when finally tested against the strongbox in Corbin's own vault, opened it exactly as Tuck's notes had promised, revealing a second set of documents, deposit records in an assumed name, deeds quietly transferred, loan terms altered after signing, that made plain, in Corbin's own bank's handwriting, precisely how the scheme had worked and how long it had run. Copper lay quietly through the whole of the hearing at Clara's feet, still and dignified, as though he too understood the gravity of a courtroom, and it was only when the clerk carried in the recovered strongbox from Corbin's vault, its lid still faintly scented with the pitch Tuck had once used to seal his barrels, that the dog lifted his head and let out a single low sound, almost a sigh, that made more than one farmer in the room glance over and smile despite themselves, as though even he had been waiting a long while to hear that particular chapter closed. Judge Hartley did not delay his ruling. He restored the cooperative charter to full legal force, striking down every mortgage and forced sale Corbin's bank had engineered against its true terms, which meant, among a great many other reversals, that the Wren Farm's supposed debt was declared fraudulent, and the property returned, in full, to Thomas Wren's rightful heir. Silas Pruitt, faced with the choice of testifying against Corbin, or being tried alongside him, chose, in the end, to talk quickly, and at great length, and left Ashford Hollow within the month, for a county too far away for his name to follow him easily. Elias Corbin was stripped of his banking license, made to repay the cooperative in full from his own considerable holdings, and escorted, by a circuit marshal who seemed to take a particular pleasure in the task, to answer for his fraud, before a judge with far less patience than Amos Hartley had shown him. What moved the town more than the justice, though, was what Clara chose to do once it was done. She did not reclaim her father's farm and disappear back into private life, content merely to have won. Instead, she stood before the same gathered families in the mended cooperage, its roof whole now, its floor swept clean, the recovered charter framed on its wall beside a portrait of Josiah Tuck someone had thought to save, and proposed that the cooperage itself be reopened, as the cooperative had always intended it, jointly owned by every founding family, its barrels once again carrying Ashford Hollow's honest harvest to market under honest weights. She would run it, she said, as Tuck had taught her without either of them quite knowing it was a lesson, but it would belong, in the truest sense, to all of them, the way the mill and the bridge already did. It was Ruth Calloway, wiping her eyes, who said what half the room was thinking, that Thomas Wren and Josiah Tuck, wherever they were, must be looking down at that moment prouder than either man had ever managed to say aloud in life. We began this story with a young woman standing at the edge of everything she knew, $4 in her hand and a dog at her heel, mocked for spending her last coin on a condemned building nobody else would touch. It is worth remembering, now, that the thing Elias Corbin and Silas Pruitt both counted on was the same thing that scrap dealer counted on at the auction, that a thing left in the dark long enough, unwanted and unlooked at, will eventually be forgotten as worthless by everyone, including, perhaps, the person standing closest to it. Clara Wren was never fooled by that arithmetic, not because she was certain of what she'd find, but because she had been raised by a father and an old cooper, both to believe that value does not vanish simply because it goes unseen. It only waits, patiently, the way a barrel waits to hold what is poured into it, for someone willing to kneel down in the dust and look closer. It took a dog's certain nose and a woman's quiet stubbornness to prove, in the end, that the $2 Clara spent that gray morning had bought not a ruin, but the truth itself, sealed and waiting, exactly where her father had promised it would be. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara Wren and her faithful hound Copper, and with the town they helped set right. If a story of quiet resilience, rewarded in the end, means something to you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a little hope tonight, and we'd love to know, is there something overlooked in your own life, a person, a place, a chance, that you suspect might be worth more than anyone's given it credit for? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.